Namaskar, good afternoon, and welcome to the second briefing on ASEAN-India Commemorative Summit. Since our briefing yesterday afternoon, a lot of events have happened. To take us through these events, I have with me Secretary East, Srimati Preeti Saran. I also have the Chief of Protocol, Sanjay Verma, JS South and Nalanda Vinay Kumar, and Joint Secretary ASEAN ML Anurag Bhushan. They have all been instrumental in pulling off a spectacular summit, in terms of not only from the substantive point of view, but also from the logistics and protocol point of view. So, ma'am, without any further delay, I give the floor to you.
Good afternoon, dear friends. Thank you, Ravish. First of all, Gantantra Divas के आप सबको मेरी शुभकामनाएं. Really wish you very happy, warm greetings on our Republic Day. And what a Republic Day it was. As you all know, we were personally present there, so we could see firsthand, and I'm sure perhaps some of you were there, but otherwise on television would have also picked up and captured this amazing spectacle of 10 leaders from the ASEAN countries, 10 heads of state and government, sitting on the dais with our Rashtrapati ji and other leaders of India to watch this amazing parade. And there was the Republic Day parade, and there was very specific elements which were specific to ASEAN as well. And of course, those elements you would have seen yourself. One was, of course, the two tableaus that, usually when we have a visiting dignitary, there's always some way to honor. And last year there was a marching contingent from the visiting. Last 2 years it has been that. This year, the components that were very specific to ASEAN leaders, as a mark of respect to them and to honor, was the fact that we had two flags of all the 10 countries and ASEAN flag as well to head the parade. And thereafter, there were two tableaus. There was the themes of the two tableaus really focused on our ancient civilizational and cultural linkages, including Buddhism, education. The Nalanda University, Bodh Gaya, was represented there. Ramayana was represented there. And our trade links, which have really, our maritime trade links, which have connected us to the ASEAN countries. And then there were, one of the schools had in fact performed a very beautiful cultural piece, again, which resonated very well with the fact that this particular summit, the 25th anniversary of our India-ASEAN Commemorative Summit, was held just a day before our Republic Day, and to have all the 10 leaders as chief guests for a Republic Day. Certainly, I will request our Chief of Protocol, Sanjay Verma, to, after I've just quickly made some opening statements, to share some other elements. But you must understand that it was a huge exercise in logistics as well. And security, because just to have summits, we've had summits of all kinds. We've had FIPIC, we've had the India-Africa Summit, we've had several other summits, but they have never been done to coincide with our Republic Day. Republic Day itself, with the number of hundreds and thousands gathered on Rajpath, itself is a huge security and a logistics bandobast affair for the entire administration of Delhi, for Delhi traffic, for the security agencies, and for the Ministry of External Affairs, because we invariably have to tackle with one dignitary. But to have been able to meticulously plan the entire presence of all 10 heads of state and government at Rajpath with precision, with punctuality, and not just the starting of the parade at 10 o'clock sharp, but even earlier, the entire summit that was held yesterday. Since we last met, I think what happened was the plenary, and followed by a gala dinner hosted by our Prime Minister, and then a bilateral that he had with President of Indonesia. And this morning, immediately after the Republic Day parade, our Prime Minister also had two bilaterals, one with Laos and the other one with the Prime Minister of Laos and the Prime Minister of Malaysia. That means I have really, we covered 9 bilaterals that he has had, and tomorrow, the Prime Minister of Cambodia, His Excellency Mr. Hun Sen, who's here with a large delegation, in fact, will be on a state visit with a full forecourt welcome to him, followed by talks and lunch, and of course, a call by External Affairs Minister on the visiting dignitary, and then meeting with a delegation talks with our Prime Minister, then calls on Uprashpati ji and Rashtrapati ji. This is as far as the program elements are concerned. So I'll first focus just on the outcome of the summit. You would have seen what our Prime Minister, the statement that he made at the plenary, because that is available on our Prime Minister's website. And then at the end, there was, and you would also heard the response of the ASEAN leaders, because the Prime Minister of Singapore, who's the chair of ASEAN, had responded to that. And then in the closed session, of course, we focused on how to move India-ASEAN relations forward. And if I were to just sum up, whether it is what has been repeatedly mentioned by all the leaders to our leadership, specifically in the bilateral calls with our Prime Minister, the sum and substance of it has been that all of the 10 ASEAN countries have appreciated India's role and the bilateral relationship that we enjoy with each one of them, and the fact that India has played such a positive role in the Indo-Pacific region. And as a result, what the message we got from the 10 leaders was that they feel India is a very important component for peace, stability, and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific region. And whether I go through the entire series of what they discussed specifically, I can share that with you. But I can tell you that this was a repeated refrain. One, that they really appreciated India's role and that they would like greater India's presence. Two, was a deep appreciation for admiration for India's growth story. All of them repeatedly acknowledged the growth rates that India is clocking at the moment, being one of the fastest growing economies, the amazing reforms that have been introduced by the government, whether it is to fight corruption. Corruption, again, is something that is very, very dear to, for example, the President of Philippines has also himself taken several initiatives, and he was particularly interested in wanting to hear more about the Aadhaar system, about the digital economy, about the desire to do cashless transactions was another issue which was of interest to Singapore, because they too would like to move more and more into cashless transactions and financial inclusion. So there was repeatedly all the leaders acknowledged, I had mentioned yesterday, Prime Minister's speech in Davos, because that seemed to have had a huge impact and a resonance for them. And that India's growth story was something they were inspired by, and as a result, they felt that they could do more in terms of greater investments and trade with India, and that India's and the reforms that are taking place can set a good example for them to replicate. So that was the second point that came out repeatedly, both in the interventions on the floor, in the closed session of the summit, in the plenary, as well as in the bilateral meetings. And the third element, of course, is what is reflected in the outcome document, which is available again on our MEA website. It is available on our MEA website, and I know that some of you have already quoted. I have seen media reports about the 3 C's of it being focused on commerce, culture, and connectivity, about the need for working collectively in combating the menace of terrorism, also of working collectively in countering radicalization. Here, in specific discussions that our Prime Minister had with the Prime Minister of Malaysia and Indonesia, they both shared their own experience and the legislation that they have introduced within their own countries in countering this. So really the soft and hard aspects of countering terrorism. The harder aspects were the strict actions to be taken through enabling laws, And the softer actions was in terms of how to ensure that the youth do not go the path of extremism or radicalization. And there has been, in the past as well, an offer made by India to host a conference, which we will, and in consultation with all of the ASEAN countries and beyond. The next, the terrorism, I've already mentioned the declaration. There are other big elements which you already quoted. Maritime cooperation was another one, specifically relating to handling both traditional and non-traditional security challenges, including humanitarian disaster relief, security cooperation, and freedom of navigation were the key areas that were identified for maritime cooperation. Yesterday, when I briefed you about the retreat, I also mentioned that they agreed to set up a mechanism for following up on discussions on maritime domain. So these were as far as the Delhi Declaration is concerned. Specifically, the announcements that were made by India, which are also contained in our Prime Minister's speech, and the one that is of utmost significance from the point of commemorating the summit was the announcement of 10 Padma Shri awards that were given to commemorate the 25th anniversary of India-ASEAN relations. And these have been given to 10 eminent people from each of the 10 ASEAN countries who have been known to make significant contributions, both in connecting India to that country or to the region, or for their seminal contribution in their specific field, whether it's in restoration of, in archaeology, for example, the Laotian recipient has contributed in the restoration of the Wat Pho monument, or Ramli Ibrahim, the dancer, Odissi dancer from Malaysia. He has made a huge contribution. He's an iconic dancer and a choreographer, not just in Malaysia recognized, but also recognized all over the ASEAN region and in India too. In fact, today when Prime Minister Najib met our Prime Minister, he said that Ramli Ibrahim, the Odissi dancer, dances Odissi dance better than you Indian dancers do. So that's how good he is at his trade. Some specific 6 very important initiatives that I have to say that you would have seen the op-ed that appeared by the Prime Minister of Singapore yesterday. Our own Prime Minister also wrote op-eds which have appeared very prominently in all of the 10 ASEAN major dailies countries. So, this is the most important, with the widest circulation newspapers, have all prominently published our own Prime Minister's op-ed, which appeared in today's newspapers. And 6 initiatives that our own Prime Minister announced as a result of discussions under the rubric of commerce, culture, connectivity, which also includes education, was 1,000 fellowships for PhD students in the Indian IITs. Second was a dedicated training course in the Indian Academy of Highway Engineering. And a third was to set up a virtual network of universities. Earlier, when our External Affairs Minister had gone, there had been, the ASEAN network of think tanks had also agreed to set up a network of universities as well as the museums. Then our Prime Minister, again, this is as a result of the discussions that took place at the plenary, Prime Minister, which was agreed to by other leaders as well, was that given the importance to digital connectivity and the importance of the role that India can play in digital connectivity with the ASEAN countries, our Prime Minister has offered to undertake pilot projects to set up digital villages in the CLMV countries under the $1 billion line of credit that was offered earlier. And once those pilot projects have been completed, we would then replicate the success of that to other countries as well. And yet another initiative that our Prime Minister announced was to have an ASEAN-India Startup Festival in this year itself. And next year, that is 2019, we would celebrate it as the year of tourism. Why was that chosen? Because when we're looking at cultural connectivity, when we're looking at enhancing trade, tourism was identified as a very important one, specifically Buddhist tourism, wellness tourism, and education. So therefore, tourism formed an important component. So as we still continue to celebrate India-ASEAN relations and build on some of these key decisions and announcements that have been made, we will also build to work towards focusing our attention on tourism, which will be celebrated in a very big way next year. I'll stop here, and I will request Sanjay to fill you in on some of the challenges and the tasks that we confronted in managing this huge exercise.
Well, thank you, ma'am. Good evening. Recognize a lot of familiar faces from a very old avatar. Let me give you a peek into what seemed like a seamless exercise, and it seemed well synchronized, things falling into place, elements following one after the other. There was a mosaic behind a lot of hard work which goes into delivering protocol targets. And idea here was to make the whole platform predictable, assured, time-bound. This was a summit plus. It just wasn't 25 years of ASEAN, but also an extraordinary and unprecedented gesture from the Government of India that we would receive 10 heads of state and governments for the Republic Day parade. Any event of this nature requires a number of rounds of consultations and meetings, etc. This began way back about 2 months ago, that we had the first advanced security liaison teams coming in from different ASEAN countries, where protocols, security, media-related issues were talked about in detail. There was again an advanced security liaison team just about 4 days before the summit. We had put into place layers of diplomatic professionals to engage with each delegation. We had a media liaison officer, a chief liaison officer, a delegation liaison officer, and spouse liaison officers. And these colleagues, about 30 of them, were flown in from different parts of the world, from different embassies. About 8 days before the visit, they were all attached to individual delegations to service each and every aspect, conceivable requirement that a delegation may have. We also had to factor in specific requirements, allergies, food habits, so that whether it was a banquet or whether it was even simple things like if you're sitting on a chair and you're allergic to a certain fabric, that had to be taken care of, particularly when it came to meals, whether it was the meal hosted in Rashtrapati Bhavan or the dinner last night, the gala dinner, which had to be executed in a time-bound manner. You'd be happy to see that in this entire summitry and the Republic Day celebrations, there was no time overrun. Today on television screen, you would have seen that 10 leaders arrived within 9 minutes of each other, but they came from 5 different hotels of the city, and they all had to converge in Rashtrapati Bhavan and then come in a straight procession, allowing Prime Minister and VP to precede and Rashtrapati ji to follow. The line I used to convince the ASEAN delegations that they needed to abide by the timeline is that 600 million people would be watching at the minimum the Republic Day celebrations live on television. And in the history of India, Republic Day parade has never started late. And even today with 10 leaders, it didn't start late. And that sort of worked. We also had to cater for requirements about interpretation, both at the simultaneous level and at the consecutive level. This was also an occasion where we had 9 bilateral meetings. So even while we had elements, the major elements of the summit, we were plugging in bilateral meetings. On 24th, we had 3. We had 4 yesterday, including one which concluded at 11 in the night after the banquet, and we had 2 this afternoon immediately after the parade. So what you see is there's a lot more work going in both behind the scenes and on screen. The leadership, Prime Minister Rashtrapati ji, MEA colleagues have been engaged for the last 2 days, morning to night, into different engagements. And as a chief protocol officer, it's been my responsibility to ensure that the playing field, the predictability of the summit is maintained. I would, as a side, I can mention that usually when we deal with such heavy requirements, we have WhatsApp group. And you'd be, every time after 3 or 4 minutes, I look at my telephone, there'd be 40 messages on the WhatsApp group, because there are at any given time over 150 officers in MEA feeding into that. This is, well, I'll conclude here. This is just to give you a sense. Let me also, before I conclude, place on record a deep appreciation for the number of stakeholders we have worked with. This includes the Delhi Police, NDMC, the hotels which we use frequently for such occasions, the agencies, the event management companies who have worked with us, and the guidance of EM, Secretary, Prime Minister, and the support of colleagues on the table. Nothing would have been possible. Thank you.
I'll also request Anurag to, Joint Secretary ASEAN, to also share details of, the meticulous planning that went on several other aspects in the run-up to the summit, as well as, some things like, for the first time, the Ministry of External Affairs mounted 2 tableaus, which is again unprecedented. But from what you've heard from our Chief of Protocol, the bottom line is that we were like ducks, swimming furiously, but you just saw us looking very calm on the surface, but we were all really very furiously, vigorously swimming and in quite a tizzy there to make this look so smooth and calm and seamless. The second was the attention to detail, which again, Chief of Protocol mentioned, meticulous attention to detail, directions coming straight from our External Affairs Minister. To again give you very small examples, this morning, the dais where our leaders were sitting, there's some heating facility, but maybe not warm enough. She personally had provided shawls to ensure that they are warm in their feet. Or the fact that every key to the hotel rooms had the flag of the country concerned. So 10 countries, each of them. And so this is again, every time we met, whether from Laos or Cambodia, they said, look, it's so thoughtful that the hotel has given us keys carrying the national flag. Now, those were instructions that came straight from our minister. Or the fact that, leaders' names were actually etched on their pillow covers, etc. Again, these are small little things which give a personal touch and attention to detail, and also our desire to make them feel welcome in our spirit of Atithi Deva Bhava. Anurag.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening. I see a lot of friends here that we have interacted over the past 1 year. Today is a day when all of us on this table feel really proud. As ministry, I think we all feel proud to be part of a ministry that undertook such a massive exercise. Today is also a day that marks the culmination of a year-long commemorative events that we organized to mark this Silver Jubilee, 25 years of our partnership with ASEAN. Secretary had earlier taken press briefing twice before the event, where she had briefed you in detail about the events that we have undertaken. But just to recap, we had an artist camp, we had a famously successful band show where we got ASEAN bands from all the ASEAN countries. And thereafter, we had multiple events where ASEAN countries participated. Ladies and gentlemen, from here, it looks like Southeast Asia is a region, but when you actually work, and I started working in AML division last year only, I realized how much diverse these countries are from one to another. And that if you go beyond the 2 or 3 big cities, you find a fantastic region which is very culturally rich, enormously promising, and something that I think a relationship that is a relationship between India that is slowly maturing. our job was to bring this relationship into very focus, especially with the, especially in the 3Cs vertical, as we call it, which is connectivity, culture, and commerce. Our activities were therefore focused in bringing all these pillars of our relationship into focus. Specifically speaking, culture, I told you just that we had an artist camp, and the product that came out of artist camp, the paintings, were actually displayed in this summit and were appreciated by every leader, including our Prime Minister. When I say connectivity, of course, connectivity was the central theme of this summit. But beyond that, for the first time, we organized a connectivity summit in December last year, where we had multiple ministers and senior officials from all 10 ASEAN countries. Thereafter, and in terms of commerce, we had the Investment Expo, the Textile Expo. The last one week or so had been particularly crazy because we really wanted to build a background to this summit. So the whole thing started with the External Affairs Minister visiting Singapore for the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas and for the ASEAN-India network of think tanks in Bangkok, which Secretary had briefed you earlier. Thereafter, we had agriculture ministers descending on 11th. This was the first time agriculture meet was organized in Delhi to bring into focus as very important sector of cooperation between the two regions. For the first time, we had a Ramayana festival, and I must put on record the kind of work that ICCR did to bring this festival within 20-25 days, you know, to get troops from all the 10 ASEAN countries. Of course, a cooperation of ASEAN countries was very forthcoming as well. And this show has been very successful. The one or two shows that I have attended have been full house. And I'm sure that all of you would have been there as well. We also had a startup festival, the Secretary talked about that we'll do. We also had a hackathon, which we gave a glimpse on the kind of future that awaits if we have a cooperation in this particular area. We had almost 25 companies that came, 125 total companies from India and ASEAN that participated in Hyderabad and Jaipur for a startup and a festival and hackathon. Both were highly valued by the Telangana government and Rajasthan government. We had a valedictory session in Delhi also. There was thereafter a few crazy days of activities that started with the ASEAN-India Investment Expo and Summit, which was organized by Ministry of Commerce and Industry together with the Ministry of External Affairs. Senior ministers, trade ministers, senior ministers, and senior officials from 10 ASEAN countries participated in this expo. Thereafter, we had a textile expo and show, because textile, we feel, is a very promising sector of cooperation, where designers, entrepreneurs, etc., from various parts of the textile value chains came together to discuss cooperation. We also had a ASEAN-India Youth Awards for the first time, where where External Affairs Minister awarded promising entrepreneurs and leaders, business leaders of both ASEAN and India. So, so this whole helter-skelter of a calendar of activities made it a very complicated exercise, because while we were preparing for the summit, we were also busy with organizing these events, going into minute details of this event, and each of these event by itself is a summit, because if you see ASEAN-India Business Expo, the Textile Expo, there were trade ministers participating. We also had a senior officials meeting, which was co-chaired by the Secretary herself. And so we also had senior officials coming in. Just to underline how important this event ASEAN considered, the Secretary General of ASEAN came on 21st and stayed as long as today. So we can really see how important this whole week was, how valued even ASEAN considered these events were, and how much pressure there was in the entire team. And I think this is very important. 50 yes, total 50 events were organized, 50 major events were organized in the last 1 year. Just to put into perspective how important we consider it was, that for the first time, at least, I don't even remember ever, I have 23 years in this service, that External Affairs Minister herself took 2 interministerial meetings where officials from across the government which were involved in it, right from the various line ministries who were participating in this summit and the allied activities, to the various agencies of Delhi government, to law and order. Everybody was invited for these meetings. Our Minister of State, General V.K. Singh, organized 2 interministerial. Secretary herself organized 1. So really the entire exercise was undertaken at a very high level to ensure that it goes on smoothly. That was one part. Finally, I think this, the last 2 days were also very, very special, because for the first time, Ministry undertook several activities which were new. Of course, the 10 leaders by itself, the presence of 10 leaders by itself is a very new thing. The second was, for the first time, Ministry of External Affairs organized 2 tableaus to mark this occasion, because it was a very new exercise for us. It was very complicated because, first of all, it was very difficult to find a tableau maker who knows about Southeast Asia and how to bring the elements of those culture back into India. So, so we had to work very closely with the tableau maker in terms of designs. The designs went through multiple iterations, right up to the level of External Affairs Minister herself, who gave a lot of time in terms of designing of that tableau. Once the design was frozen, it was, I thought the 2 tableaus captured the entire heritage, shared heritage between ASEAN and India. The first tableau marked the boat, which is symbolic of the maritime connectivity that India and ASEAN shared, not just now, but from centuries. The second part was Nalanda, which again represented Education Connect. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that you know how important Nalanda was for people in Southeast Asia. And we have evidences of the kings in Southeast Asia who had actually endowed this university in terms of construction of hostels for the students of Southeast Asia. So Nalanda was another symbol of Education Connect, and this was very dear to, I must say this was very dear, this theme was very dear to our minister. The second theme was that of Ramayana, because as I told you, Ramayana festival, Ramayana in various versions is found in most of the places, and you'll be surprised how many versions there are and how much they differ from each other, not just from our Ramayana, but between their own versions of Ramayana. The second part was the Bodh Gaya, because I think Bodh Gaya is considered a very important, a very holy pilgrimage site, and any Buddhist from that region who travels to India finds his travel incomplete unless he visits Bodh Gaya. So we had a Mahabodhi tree and a Bodha temple, and these 2 temples were very beautifully encapsulated the culture. To bring their culture also, we had a ground element of couple from each country who wore the clothes of that country, and that's very interesting because we had no idea about what kind of, at least the designer had no idea what clothes they were. So they had to work very closely with the local embassy officials. The local embassy official gifted clothes to them to ensure that they are very genuine and authentic. The Ramayana artists that you see on top of the tableau are all local people from all across India. And when they started, they had nary knowledge about Southeast Asia, not leave out Ramayana. But all of them studied very hard. They watched news. The masks were constructed out of the images that came out of that region from our embassies, and we made it. The third thing is stamps, commemorative stamps, and I think that is also a very, very new item.
You heard directly from the source how the entire thing was planned, and the idea was to give you a flavor about the behind-the-scene activity, and that is the reason why we got the Chief of Protocol as well as JS ASEAN to share some of those behind-the-scene happenings, with all of you. The floor is now open to questions. Ashokji.
I thought after such a detailed briefing, there'd be no questions. We've answered in anticipation.
My question is, in the Republic Day tabloid, why the Ramayana from Vietnam, Brunei, and Singapore were missing? And so also in the cultural events.
For the simple reason that, there is a very close cultural connect, but Ramayana is not necessarily played in its full form in the three countries that you mentioned. With Vietnam, they have the charm. They have the charm dance forms, which are again very similar to the Indian mudras. And we had invited them to perform those dance forms as part of the Ramayana festival. From Brunei, again, the group that has come has performed the mudras. So where there is no specific Ramayana theme, we wanted to include all 10, so all were included, but not specifically only focused on Ramayana, but on our common cultural dance forms.
Vinita, and then Sridhar.
Ma'am, can you give us some detail about the bilaterals with the Prime Minister of Laos and Malaysia?
Ma'am,
Indonesia
all
also.
three bilaterals.
All three. So I'll quickly run through all three bilaterals. Common what was common? You've captured the common. I'll quickly go through for what are the common elements of the meetings, not just of the three leaders that we are telling you about, but of all the 9 leaders that our Prime Minister has bilaterally met. 10, of course, he will be having a full meeting tomorrow with the Cambodian Prime Minister. But what was repeatedly reiterated again and again in all the 3 meetings, plus the earlier ones that I briefed you about, was a deep appreciation for the summit arrangements and the warm hospitality. And we've given you details about how attention to detail and our desire to, really convey our deep appreciation. In little gestures, including the big ones, were there. There was also high praise for our Republic Day parade. I think for all of the leaders, it was a great experience. And their delegations, because I was sitting in the enclosure where the rest of the ASEAN delegations were sitting, and the enthusiasm with which they watched the parade was itself very, very energizing for me and very satisfying for us. So there was high praise for the Republic Day parade and the courtesies that were shown to all of the delegations as well as to the member states by recognizing, typically with the, the flags, the tableaus, focus on common cultural connects, etc. Specifically as far as Indonesia is concerned, you would remember that the President of Indonesia had come on a state visit in December 2016. And thereafter, of course, a series of decisions were taken, including high-level exchange. So we have, in that 1 year, since his last visit, undertaken a series of high-level exchanges, including an energy dialogue, trade dialogue, etc. And then finally, our Foreign External Affairs Minister had gone to Indonesia earlier this month for the Joint Commission meeting with her counterpart, the Foreign Minister of Indonesia. And in this particular month, in the run-up to President Joko Widodo's presence here, there have been 2-3 other very important developments and visits, including the first National Security Advisor level talks with Indonesia to enhance and establish regular mechanisms for security cooperation. The visit of their defense minister, who also met with the Raksha Mantri, but he also participated in the Raisina dialogue. The fact that we established the first policy dialogue at a track 1.5 level were again very important prologues to the final meeting that President of Indonesia had with our Prime Minister. Immediately, the President of Indonesia reiterated his invitation to our Prime Minister, which had been extended by him earlier, in December 2016 when he visited, and reiterated subsequently. And I'm happy to say that Prime Minister has very warmly accepted that invitation, and he would be going to Indonesia. Of course, they reviewed the various bilateral mechanisms that I've talked about, the Foreign Office consultations that were held earlier last year, the Joint Commission meeting, our security dialogue. And then they decided to accelerate economic cooperation, increasing Indian companies' participation in infrastructure sector in Indonesia. And the Indonesian president conveyed his support for the Indo-Pacific concept and said that he would work with India to ensure peace and security in the region. The president also conveyed appreciation for India's support for ASEAN-led mechanisms for maritime cooperation with India, and said that would be Indonesia's priority. Finally, there were de-radicalization, I've already mentioned, was one that came up for discussion. And then there was discussion on cooperation for island connectivity and for developing blue economy. You know that we are all seafaring nations, and Indonesia, comprising of thousands of islands, in fact, has only maritime neighbors. And in that, India happens to be its immediate maritime neighbor. On Lao PDR, Prime Minister, you would recall, had gone to Vientiane in 2016, November, for the ASEAN-related summits. And at that time, he had, in fact, met the Prime Minister, because he was appointed in April 2016. With Laos, we have, again, very strong cultural linkages, and that's obvious, the symbols being the Wat Pho temple, and other Indian monuments. In fact, the Laotian national who's been honored with the Padma Shri happens to be the one who had made a contribution to restoring a Wat Pho temple. And then they talked about, our traditional development assistance program, where India has $150 million worth of projects in water and transmission lines that have been completed. So that is one very good example of timely execution of development cooperation projects. There is a proposal for extending a line of credit for construction of an agricultural college, and both our leaders from both sides conveyed their desire to complete the formalities to start expediting this project. There were other new projects that were proposed in the connectivity field of physical and digital connectivity and of extension of the trilateral highway. We have ongoing defense cooperation in terms of capacity building there, and there was discussion about enhancing that further. There were other capacity building programs, including human resource development, English language training, and that was also discussed. A restoration of monuments and ancient sites. Our Prime Minister, invited a business delegation from Lao PDR to undertake road shows in major cities to attract Indian investments in Laos. And here there is a project development fund which has been announced, which in fact is intended to encourage Indian investors and businessmen to invest in the CLMV countries, and we hope that this particular roadshow will give a boost. And then there was recognition that the Prime Minister of Lao PDR said that the Delhi Declaration was a very good document and that Lao PDR would support its expeditious implementation. Contents of the document are already available with you. As far as Malaysia is concerned, again, our Prime Minister and Prime Minister of Malaysia have had frequent interactions. Bilaterally, of course, he had a full state visit 1 year back, and then thereafter they've been meeting very frequently on the margins of these major summits. They have a very good equation with each other, and they talked about the excellent cooperation in trade and investment, and of the participation of Malaysian companies in implementing a lot of road projects in different states of India. And they talked about further cooperation in railways and infrastructure, about enhancing law enforcement agencies, again, countering terrorism and countering radicalization, which is a discussion I mentioned earlier, and of further enhancing defense cooperation. We already have existing very good defense cooperation with Malaysia, and they talked about undertaking, enhancing this, particularly in the light of the fact that both our countries, India and Malaysia, do have common defense platforms where we can work together. Our Prime Minister invited the Malaysian companies to avail of new avenues of investment in India in the civil aviation sector. I think I've covered all the three. Yeah.
Sridhar.
Ma'am, I actually just have two clarifications. The first, you mentioned that India is going to organize a conference on terrorism, on counterterrorism, on counterterrorism, that's what I meant.
On countering radicalization.
Yeah,
Not
yeah.
on countering terrorism is a huge other exercise
Yes.
which is undertaken
Yes.
bilaterally
This
with all of
is
them.
specifically for the, with the, who will be the participants, the ASEAN countries and India, and when will the conference be organized? Could you give us some details about that? And the second one, you mentioned that about this 1,000 fellowships in IIT, which you said was decided at the plenary session. So could you just give us some details about this also, 1,000 fellowships?
Is it related to this? Connected to
Terrorism.
counter radicalization?
No, it is connected to terrorism, cross-border terrorism. Okay, Madam, I think that this is the first time that ASEAN has taken a resolution in this Delhi Declaration about cross-border terrorism. So how did you pursue them and how it figured?
Akhilesh, this was a different question, but I will get it. Just hold on. Athar, just hold on. I think
No, you don't, perhaps my answer will answer your question. So to begin with, I'll first go on to the fellowship programs. As I mentioned earlier, that in the course of the discussions, there was a desire, India has undertaken traditionally capacity building programs, including under the ITEC program, in several of the ASEAN countries. And there has been a deep appreciation of the capacity building and the scholarship programs that India offers to several of the ASEAN countries. It does not necessarily offer scholarships to all the 10 countries. For example, there is a reverse trend in a country like Philippines, where there are several Indian students studying medicine there. So there we have benefited from the capabilities. But the Sultan of Brunei, for example, recalled when he met our Prime Minister that he himself had, been taught by Indian teachers. So there has been a very strong educational connect ongoing over years between India and ASEAN, and a desire to enhance this cooperation of education, which focuses on youth, focuses on capacity building. And in that context, our Prime Minister, at the end of the discussions, concluded it by offering these 1,000 additional scholarships in IITs for PhD programs. Coming to the question on the text that is contained, the several references to the paragraphs on terrorism, when you read the contents of that text, you will see that there is, of course, very strong language of the 11 leaders coming together to strongly not only condemn terrorism, but also to recognize that this menace requires collective action, global as well as regional. Terrorism does not know any boundaries. You know what is cross-border terrorism. You know that when it knows no boundaries, you cannot be selective in terrorism. You can't say good and bad terrorism. And in that context, the fact that the 10 leaders of ASEAN recognized it and endorsed it in this declaration shows the need and the recognition of this menace to be fought collectively. On the question of the countering radicalization, this particular conference, this has been in discussion for some time. It came out as a result of specific discussions that our leadership has had with the leaders in Malaysia and Indonesia, because both these countries have had very successful programs and legislation in position on ensuring that their youth are not radicalized. Again, in that context, Prime Minister of India at an ASEAN summit last year had offered to undertake a conference, a seminar for discussion amongst concerned experts to discuss learn from each other's experiences. And in that context, I would also mention that there are positive experiences as well. Indonesia and Malaysia are positive experiences. India too has had some very positive experience of handling this particular menace, because it can be very toxic if it were to spread. And the fact that they've managed to contain it, the fact that we all come from very plural, tolerant, diverse societies where the importance of keeping the fact that we have a very strong, dynamic youth bulge who should be positively focused. And in that context, there is a huge problem of radicalization of youth taking place through the internet and otherwise, where we felt that this particular conference, and it will be a global conference, but the experiences of India and the ASEAN countries would be one which can actually set a very positive example for the rest of the world. And that's where it comes in.
Akhilesh, she has already answered that. Athar, your question is answered on... Okay, Athar.
I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask my question anyway. This conference as being organized, will the focus be on specifically, you said counter-radicalization. Will the focus or the motif, so to say, will be Islamic fundamentalism or Islamization fundamentalism? Or will we look at this conference, that is, we'll look at all sorts of religious fundamentalism that considers religiosity as perhaps its motif as well, if you know what I mean.
We've always maintained that terrorism does not have a religion. And when we talk about radicalization of youth or extremism, it is in the context of extremism in its form, but not related to, associated to any religion. No, for sure.
Devirupa.
Ma'am, this is a clarification that I wanted. Yesterday at the press conference, you had said that during the retreat, there was a talk among the leaders for a mechanism on maritime cooperation. So I just wanted to check with you, I mean, because in the Delhi Declaration, there's not a specific mention about this kind of mechanism. There is one talk about that India had proposed, I think, a framework for a blue economy. Is that what you were referring to, or is there something else that is in the works?
No, I don't have the exact text with me, but if you read the entire Delhi Declaration, there is a specific reference to maritime cooperation in the context of humanitarian disaster relief, in the context of security cooperation, or freedom of navigation as being key areas of maritime cooperation. So that is where it is. If you read the language, you will get the full content of it.
Ranjit ji, then Siddhant.
Madam, ASEAN leaders also emphasized on early conclusion of RCEP. So is India ready for that? Has India got any reservations on RCEP?
No, not at all. India participated in the RCEP negotiations as a very enthusiastic partner. India is a huge market for all of the participating other 15 countries. India itself, I think, would have a lot to gain to be part of this regional grouping, which is why we have participated very diligently in the negotiations. But, you know, when there are 6 countries involved, obviously everyone has to take on board everybody else's concerns. What we have maintained, and we've shared with our counterparts through the negotiations, has been that we look forward to a balanced outcome, which takes on board all elements of what is strictly regarded as a free trade agreement, including goods, services, investments. And that's, you know, when they are negotiating, we cannot specifically talk. When negotiations are undergoing, you cannot talk about specific concerns because it's really not for me to divulge. It's really for the negotiators. All I can say is that we maintain that we expect it to be a balanced outcome which is acceptable to all parties concerned.
Siddhant.
Ma'am, I have 2 questions. One is on, did Zakir Naik came up during discussions during the bilateral with Malaysia? Secondly, on connectivity. Zakir Naik. And secondly, on connectivity, did predatory practices by certain countries were discussed when the ASEAN leaders met with the Indian leadership, predatory economic practices?
So, no to both your questions.
Ma'am, what we have been achieved so far with these 25 years of India-ASEAN friendship? What's the achievement of these all 25 years? To just sum up.
Well, I would like to say that everything that we've been saying for the last half an hour is a complete failure. If at the end of this briefing you're asking me what have you achieved, that's what we've been talking about. What have we achieved? we've achieved, I think, a great deal.
Please
in
take a look.
terms of the 3 rubrics. So, if you, after that, you ask me this question, I think perhaps we've not communicated it well to you.
To start with, I think please take a look at the Delhi Declaration. I think there's a lot of substance in that. Yes, please.
Secretary, as you mentioned that maritime cooperation, one of the key area of cooperation is freedom of navigation. What are the key issues or common challenges discussed in the summit? Especially in the Delhi Declaration, we see the implementation of DOC and the early conclusion of COC in South China Sea. Thank you.
So, you will see that both India and the 10 ASEAN countries are positioned in the Indo-Pacific region, which is the waters which carries 90% of global trade. And therefore, it is essential for all of us countries to be participating. Again, we are seafaring maritime nations, and so therefore for us, maritime cooperation becomes a very important element. And in that context, we firmly believe, as do the ASEAN countries, as you've seen from the declaration which has been endorsed, that freedom of navigation is an important element for movement of goods and people. And also for peace, prosperity, and stability of the region.
Dipanjan and then Kalol.
We heard about the Prime Minister's speech and Singapore Prime Minister's speech at the plenary yesterday. The rest were closed door, as I understand, like all plenaries. Could you just give a sense of the other 9 leaders, what would have they said? And
I've already gone through the whole exercise. Either you were not paying attention, or maybe you replay.
No, plenary in particular. What the other leaders sort of give
The
us
other leaders, is exactly what they've said is what is captured in the Delhi Declaration. The Delhi Declaration was adopted at the end of the summit, after listening to everybody's views on board. So
anything particular?
No, it's contained in the declaration. Specifics I've already mentioned, the fact that they've conveyed their deep appreciation for India's role, that they'd like India to, play a greater part, that India is very important. India specific, they said. The rest is all contained in that declaration.
Kalol.
Congratulations on the successful summit. My question is regarding what the Prime Minister said in his plenary speech. He was very, I think, quite frank in the opening statement itself, where he said that security cooperation and freedom of navigation will be the key focus. Can you please name the problem that you face in freedom of navigation, in ensuring freedom of navigation in the region? You have talked about South China Sea, but isn't it the issue that the Chinese building up of artificial islands and possible hindrances to air traffic and maritime traffic is what you are referring to? I want you to name the problem to freedom of navigation and why this this reference to freedom of navigation is so significant for us.
I did not name any problem, and nor did he name any problem. When we talk about freedom of navigation and security challenges for maritime countries, it is specifically related to both traditional and non-traditional threats.
Two separate questions, but quick answers. One is to do with, could you just tell us where we are vis-a-vis India-ASEAN FTA, if there is something happening in that particular domain? And number two, for my own particular understanding, I'm curious, whenever you have a gathering of so many leaders, when it comes to protocol, how do you decide who sits where? Who sits next to the PM, left, right, center? How does one decide that? That must be quite a thing.
So there's already an India-ASEAN FTA in goods, which is operational. There is another one that is negotiated and signed on services and investment. The service and investment has not been ratified by 2 countries who are completing their internal processes. But even while we are in discussions on RCEP and we have bilateral arrangements with some of the 10 countries, a SICA with Singapore, for example, which is in its 2nd round of discussions, another one with Thailand. But we also have this FTA, which is already in position. So there is already an ASEAN-India FTA in goods. Moving on to your other question about the seating, for us, there is strict protocol, but there's no one size fit all. In the ASEAN context, we go strictly by their own protocol, their own secretariat, because they have a very set protocol, and that's what we follow in consultation with them.
No, please just use the mic, otherwise it won't be captured.
Madam, in Republic Day parade, when the protocol was different, when they were scaling up this stage, and while coming down, the order was reversed.
There's a rocket science to diplomacy, and if you want me to deconstruct that, let me say that there is a protocol order to things. The most fundamental is that royalty trumps elected representatives. And then you have region-specific protocol, the ASEAN protocol. India has its own protocol. And sometimes when the occasion demands, functionality becomes a criteria. So when the leaders were getting onto Rajpath and to the saluting base, we had to work between seniority, ASEAN protocol, and the fact that they were spread over 5 different hotels, and there were bubble movements. I'm getting a little technical here. Bubble movements of 3 leaders moving together, depending on which part of the city they were. So you're right, you noticed that there was a change. Now the change is also because some of them had to leave early for the airport. So a lot of things are taken into account, the permutation. We could actually come up with an algorithm on protocol after this visit. And of course, there's the ASEAN culture, which in itself suggests a certain amount of informality, which helps, and consultation, yes. I hope I've confused you enough.
The last...
that was the idea.
Last, maybe Manas, anybody else?
I may just conclude by saying that all the arrival orders, positioning, placement in banquets was done in consultation with the ASEAN Secretariat.
So the last 2 questions, Manas and then...
Ma'am, as you said, in fact, almost all ASEAN leaders appreciated India's role in ensuring peace, stability and security.
I didn't say almost, I said all ASEAN leaders.
Peace, security, stability in the Indo-Pacific region. So ma'am, was there any expectation from any of the ASEAN leaders for India to play a more proactive role in the Indo-Pacific region actually, in the context of
Yes.
Chinese assertiveness?
India-ASEAN relations stand on their own.
Right.
They don't require any third party's participation. Right. Yes, because India-ASEAN relations stand on their own, yes, all the leaders conveyed their desire for a greater participation of India, because
And
they
ma'am,
realize
in fact,
India plays a very positive role.
Ma'am, was there any apprehension from any of the leaders about India joining the Quad, India, Australia, US and Japan?
Manas, you are moving to a very different question now.
Was there any apprehension, ma'am?
It is not related to ASEAN, and it was not discussed.
No,
Yes,
I'm just saying Mr. Vinay Kumar could answer that, I guess,
Okay.
since he's been quiet for a while.
No, I think...
It's a very important issue. If it was not discussed, then what could
No, as we mentioned, it was not discussed specifically. Yes, please, the last question.
मैम आई एम्स तो हिंदी मैडम, ये जो रोहिंग्या मुस्लिम का जो इशू था म्यांमार का, रोहिंग्या मुस्लिम का, इस इशू में आसियान ने क्या सोचा है?
रोहिंग्या इशू
जो म्यांमार का रोहिंग्या मुस्लिम का जो इंसान,
ये जो आप सवाल पूछ रहे हैं, ये स्पेसिफिकली मेंशन नहीं हुआ, ये समिट में मेंशन नहीं हुआ। ये आसियान का बायलैटरल मुद्दा है, जो जैसा हमने पहले बताया था, वो उस ढंग से डिस्कस होता है।
में इसका विषय में कुछ चर्चा नहीं,
इसमें नहीं हुआ। Thank you to all the speakers.
Thank you very much, and thank you for listening to us for
joining.
such a long time. I think you must be very tired by now.
Thank you. Have a good evening.